El economista camerunés Chunjang Puemi observó que sin soberanía monetaria efectiva, ningún Estado puede desarrollar políticas económicas que permitan la acumulación de capital y el pleno empleo de recursos y trabajadores. Yo no había oído hablar nunca de Chunjang Puemi, digamos que el excesivo eurocentrismo o anglocentrismo de la profesión económica pues nos lleva a ignorar a autores interesantes que trabajaron en otros continentes. Al parecer nos narra Ndongo Samba Sylla, nuestro invitado de hoy, que Chunjang Puemi se refería socarronamente al Fondo Monetario Internacional como el fondo de miseria instantánea, ¿no? Son los economistas de estos países que conocen de primera mano, en primera persona, las consecuencias de renunciar a la soberanía monetaria y de las políticas a las que te obliga, ¿no? al sometimiento, en definitiva, al que te obliga esa carencia de soberanía monetaria a las instituciones multilaterales como el Fondo Monetario Internacional, los que nos hablan con más conocimiento de causa, ¿no? Eh, Hoy vamos a conversar Patricia Pino de MMT Podcast y miembro de RDMMT y yo con Ndongo Samba Sylla, coautor de un libro muy recomendable que se titula La última divisa colonial de África, la historia del franco CFA. Es un libro evidentemente que trata sobre un tema monetario, pero que contiene incluso, diría, jugosas anécdotas sobre, digamos, las estratagemas que utilizó la República Francesa para perpetuar su dominio colonial sobre los nuevos estados supuestamente independizados del imperio colonial francés en África. Desde luego se lee de forma muy fácil, muy amena y, insisto, muy recomendable. Desafortunadamente no está disponible en castellano, sí que está disponible la versión inglesa, que es traducción a su vez de la versión original francesa. Lamentablemente no hemos podido hablar con la otra autora, Fanny Pijot, pero a los dos autores los representan con mucha solvencia Ndongo Samba Sylla. Ndongo Samba Sylla es economista y sociólogo por la Universidad de París Diderot y también obtuvo un doctorado en economía del desarrollo por la Universidad de Versailles-Saint-Quentin en Yvelines, cerca de París. Actualmente es gerente de proyectos e investigador de la Fundación Rosa Luxemburgo en Dakar, en Senegal. Anteriormente ha sido consultor en comercio justo y también ha sido asesor de la presidencia de la República de Senegal. Es muy interesante la conversación con Ndongo Samba Sylla. Obviamente este libro lo escribió desde una perspectiva de teoría de la moneda moderna. Eso no es una sorpresa, obviamente, para quienes nos seguís. Eh, pero a mí lo que me interesa es además su convencimiento, su afirmación de que la teoría monetaria moderna es muy útil para estudiar la situación de países en vías de desarrollo, en países que sufren situaciones de dominio colonial y por tanto contradice una de las afirmaciones más insidiosas de los críticos de la teoría monetaria moderna, que hay quienes afirman que la TMM solo sirve o solo aplica a países avanzados, en especial a Estados Unidos, y que no es aplicable a los países en vías de desarrollo, ¿no? Nosotros desde la TMM siempre hemos contestado que por supuesto que la TMM es útil para analizar la situación de los países en vías de desarrollo, útil para entender en qué consiste la restricción externa y cómo se puede gestionar. es útil para entender los sistemas monetarios de países periféricos y las consecuencias también de no ejercer la soberanía monetaria. Porque la TMM, como hemos explicado muy a menudo, es una teoría, es decir, es una lente, un instrumento, una herramienta que nos permite analizar problemas económicos de una forma novedosa y probablemente más innovadora y útil que la que aportan otras escuelas de pensamiento económico. Y en especial para los países que más huérfanos están precisamente de políticas, de teorías que permitan diseñar políticas que permitan avanzar y progresar y salir de su situación actual, ¿no? Así que sin más preámbulos, pues pasamos a la conversación que Patricia Pino de MMT Podcast y miembro de esta asociación y yo mismo mantuvimos con Ndongo Samba Sylla, que estoy seguro enseguida comprobarán que es una bellísima persona, muy cercana, muy cálida y con una gran erudición y conocimiento del sistema monetario de los países africanos. Que disfruten.
My first encounter with the MMT, I think, dated back to the summer of 2017 with my Tunisian colleague, Maha. Maha is an economist, and she's a program manager at the Rosa Luxembourg office in Tunis. And we were discussing about, economics. And she told me, do you know MMT, for example? I don't know, no idea about MMT. And she told me, you have to read that literature as we are doing some work on the CFA franc and monetary sovereignty. It could be a good literature for you. And from there, I started to read some literature on MMT. And we, with Fanny Pigeot, we started to write our book in, let's say, February 2018. So at that point, I have started to read a bit some literature on MMT. And when I started to read it, I was literally, let's say, in love with MMT, because for the first time, I saw an approach saying that, monetary sovereignty is important. And before, I couldn't find such a kind of approach, because even, let's say, some radical approaches like the Marxist approach, they would say that, you have to take care of other things first, for example, class struggles or the space structure, many other things, but not monetary sovereignty. Monetary sovereignty is just, let's say, an epiphenomenon, so it's not really the most important matter. So I was really happy.
So what was your first MMT text, the first one that fell in your hands and you read through? Do you remember?
I think it was the blog, A New Economic Perspectives. I think. Yeah. And from there, I read books by Randall Ray on modern monetary.
Okay, excellent. Patricia, just jump ahead if you want to do any questions. I don't want to carry all the weight of the interview, but I would like to ask you briefly about your career as an economist. I was especially intrigued about your role as an advisor to the president of Senegal, and also a little bit about what you're doing with the Rosa Luxembourg Foundation as well.
In fact, my first, let's say, professional job was at the Centre d'études de l'emploi. So it was a center specialized on unemployment. And because I did my my master on the concept of employability, and I tried to show that you could not use that concept to explain unemployment, because at the time there was this so-called European employment strategy, and employability was a key concept in that strategy. So the basic microeconomic explanation was that if you are on unemployment, it's because you don't have the skills. While we know that employment is a macroeconomic, let's say, phenomenon. Sometimes, it's due to other things than lack of skills, etc. And from there, I got a job at the Center for Employment Studies, and I worked there for 5 years. And at the same time, I was doing my PhD on employment issues in Senegal, in the informal sector, but through an employment perspective. And while I was finishing my PhD, I had the opportunity to have to work at the Senegalese presidency.
Let's then delve into the main issue of that I wanted to discuss in this interview is the CFA francs. I'm saying francs in plural because there's more than one. Can you talk a little bit? Can you talk? Just guide us through the history of the CFA franc and describe their colonial origin. And why it's still a colonial institution in many ways.
Yeah, the CFA franc was born in 1945, just after the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And it was called at that time franc of the French colonies in Africa. Mm-hmm. That was the name of the acronym. And the CFA franc was born out of a devaluation of the French franc, because the French franc was the currency circulating in the, let's say, French colonial empire in Africa. And so after the Second World War, there has been a, let's say, a decision that had to be taken, whether we apply a uniform rate of devaluation of the franc throughout the empire, or if different rates were to be used. Because the inflation rates evolved differently during the war period, differently in the colonies and in the metropolis. And so the decision was taken separately to have different rates of devaluation. And so this gave birth to the what were called colonial francs, so the CFA franc and also the Pacific franc. And what was interesting is that when the CFA franc was created, it had a higher external value compared to the French franc. So one CFA franc was exchanged with 1.70 French franc. Mm-hmm. And 3 years later, one CFA franc was exchanged with 2 French franc. That was really awkward because
France had suffered a lot more destruction during the Second World War and presumably was facing more severe inflationary pressures than Africa, which had been more spared, had suffered less damage, right?
Yeah, to some extent that is true. Yeah.
But I'm interested in you say that there was decided that they were going to have different rates of devaluation. So the kind of the value of the currencies were still controlled by France. It's just that they decided to stagger them. Is that the right way of seeing it? And why? So it benefited them that the kind of the French franc was slightly lower than the CFA franc in a sense. So where did that benefit come from?
Yeah, because during the war period, as France was divided, there was also the commercial trade ties were severed between the metropolis and the colonies. And most colonies started to, let's say, to trade with Latin America, Asia, etc. And by giving them an overvalued currency, the thing is that, those colonies could no longer export anything abroad. So they had to go to France to expect to sell something. And at the same time, having an overvalued currency is also a way of having, let's say, it encourages imports. So that means that France would find outlets in Africa because they have an overvalued currency. And it worked like that. And after the Second World War, France was, let's say, able to reconquer, let's say, its lost trade shares in its own colonial empire. And the CFA franc has been really instrumental in that, because the French economy was so weak that it could not compete globally. So France had, let's say, a captive, let's say, empire to help its reconstruction.
So I guess in a sense, it was an operation to stop, I guess, the colonies in Africa from breaking away from the metropolis And it's interesting, I think, when I was reading your book, I was found fascinating how France became actually or behaved like a rogue state in many senses. And there's this several stories which I wasn't aware of. I have to admit, I've never heard about them. But for example, the story of Opération Persil, and there are other similar stories in which really France used its clout to stop any attempt of seceding from this monetary union. Can you give us
Educate
a
us
flavor of those shady operations of the French intelligence in Africa in the 1960s and onwards?
Yeah, sure. In fact, what happened was that after the Vietnam, in fact, the Indochina War, and the start of the war, Algerian War, France knew that decolonization was inevitable. And her objective was that, how to give them independence without sovereignty. And the deal was made between France, the French government, and the African elites at that time, because most of them were trained in France. And even some of them served as a member of parliament in France. So they were loyal French, let's say, allies. And France told them, we're going to give you independence, but without sovereignty. That means, for example, we're going to decide your external trade, your educational system, your currency, etc. Everything. And they signed it. And for example, a country like Gabon, the same day of its independence, signed a cooperation agreement saying that if you want to export your raw materials, the starting raw materials, you have to have the consent of France. And we're gonna have our military bases extra. And they accepted that. All of them except Sékou Touré. Sékou Touré was a trade unionist, so he had a different background. And in 1958, there was, let's say a referendum asking, let's say, the former colonies, do you want independence or not? Guinea was the only country saying that we want independence. And why? Because Sékou was so organized that he made sure that the referendum would not be cheated, because in other countries it was cheated. And somehow when you hear that in Africa, Francophone Africa, elections used to be cheated, this is a colonial legacy. Is France, as let's say, as a professor. Yeah.
So how were they cheated? Like they faked the votes? What happened?
They faked the votes, the ballots. Yeah.
Oh my God.
That's how they did. And you could now find, let's say, all the elder people who will tell you that I have voted against for independence, but you see that we are not.
So the ballot boxes were stuffed with additional ballots.
That's the classical stuff from this period already. So when some Francophone African presidents do such kind of things, it's just a continuation of the
long-standing tradition. But Sékou Touré managed to win that referendum of independence, 95%, I think it was. And then what happened was, I think that's very interesting. What happened
2 years later, he decided to issue its own Guinea's currency, national currency, because he knew that the CFA franc was a straitjacket, too rigid. And he told France, I want to stay within the franc zone, but you have to alter the rules. France would never accept. And so he decided to issue a national currency for Guinea. But as a reprisal, France organized an operation of destabilization called Operation Persil. And one aspect of it was for the French secret services to flood counterfeit banknotes in the Guinean economy so as to disrupt it. And they were really successful at doing that. And those who did that sabotage wrote that in books that it was really, let's say, superb. We managed to disrupt the whole Guinean economy. And this was also a message to the other countries. If you want to follow the dangerous path of Sékou Touré, you'll know what happened. And this has been Operation Persil.
This sounds awfully familiar, Stuart.
Well, it's not the only example, right? There are other examples in the book, and I encourage listeners to purchase the book. because
many killings, blackmails.
It's not only about economics. There's also some secret operations there, destabilizing operations. It's a book that goes beyond dry economics. There's a little bit of intrigue as well in some of those episodes.
So if there were some leaders who were against the CFA franc, is it because they understood currencies in the way MMT understands currencies?
Yeah, I don't think they had the MMT understanding, but at least they have a political understanding of currency, knowing that you could not be a sovereign state without issuing your own currency. For example, a Malian socialist leader, Modibo Keïta, knew that. There's another African leader, Sylvanus Olympio, he also knew that. Modibo Keïta, let's say, exited the CFA franc for a moment, but after, he was removed from power, and Mali was back to the franc zone. The same for Sylvanus Olympio, who was a lawyer and also trained in economics, and he wanted to issue a national currency for Togo, but he was killed before the national currency would be issued, and Togo had never had a national currency. So for France, its former colonies should never have monetary sovereignty, no independent currency. And the African leaders have, let's say, somehow cultivated that kind of view that it's dangerous to have your own national currency. Everything but not national currency.
Yes, because they've seen what's happened to other African leaders who have. So, but there's also an economist called Chunjang Puemi, who I understand had a good grasp of what it meant to lose your or not have monetary sovereignty, right? Is that correct? Do you think, from your readings of his texts, he was also very vocal about gaining a monetary sovereignty for African states, right?
Yeah. Joseph Chunjang Puemi was a Cameroonian economist and also a former, let's say, he used to work for the IMF, International Monetary Fund, but he called it instant misery fund. That's why.
That's a good one.
I'm going to call it that from now on.
I like that.
That's why he left it. And he was saying that the CFA franc was let's say, the least sovereign currency in the world. So it was totally anti-development and totally, let's say, looking back to the past and not, let's say, the future, because the CFA franc is a system in which you could not, the countries could not use, let's say, the magic of money. That means the power to issue your own currency and to create money to allocate it, let's say, to projects that could help your own development. He will say that this is impossible with the CFA franc, and we have to get rid of that. But he died he wrote his book in 1980, and he died in 1984 under, let's say, mysterious circumstances. He was really a very brilliant guy, but he died young.
That's a shame. I think he had a good, from what little I've read from your quotes of his text, I think he had a relatively good grasp about the importance of currency. How do you think an understanding of MMT has helped you to understand how the CFA francs are undermining the development of your countries and basically holding them back? And as you very well said at the end, I think it's towards the end of your book, when you look at whatever index you want to look at, those countries have not prospered since independence, and they've been held back, and some of them are in the lowest ranks in human development indices, etc. So how does your understanding of MMT help you analyze the problem that's the CFA francs, and why? Because I think there is, when you talk about people who are actually arguing in favor of remaining in the CFA francs, they use arguments which are very familiar to us here in the Eurozone. greater stability, less inflation, lower interest rates. Monetary stability is a great excuse to justify the euro, and it's striking that the same arguments are being used in Africa by the elites, by the government agencies, by the multilateral agencies, and economists, and so forth. I think MMT helps you get through the sort of the crap, right, and understand what's really going on, right?
Yeah, I was somehow armed by MMT against all this rhetoric of monetary stability. And if you exit from the CFA frame, you'll be in a situation like Zimbabwe, every time they say Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
But what is important about MMT? Because, there's this debate that MMT could not be applied in developing countries. I do not like this concept applied. Because for me, you could not find a more powerful framework to analyze the monetary and fiscal dimensions of colonialism than MMT. You can't. There is no rival of MMT. Why? And this helped me myself understand better colonialism through the MMT lens. Because in MMT, you find the view that tax drives money. And you couldn't find that during colonial times. Because what happened was that Africans had their currency systems. And in West Africa, for example, we use the cowries, which is a shell, and the first thing the colonial powers did, for example, France, they said, you will not have the right to import cowries because it was imported from the Indian Ocean. The second thing is that you have to pay taxes, but in our own currency, not in cowries. And so how could you pay taxes in franc if you don't issue the franc? That means that the purpose of taxes was to create a demand for the franc and indirectly to restructure the whole economy in favor of, let's say, the extractivist colonial model. That was the purpose of taxes. And this was something you could see clearly during the colonial time. And the other thing is that all this now neoliberal rhetoric of sound finance, this also has colonial origins, because at that time it was not sound finance, it was Gladstonian finance. Gladstonian finance means that the imperial adventure, the imperial project has to pay for itself. That means through taxes and no help, financial help from the metropolis. So that means that the governments, colonial governments, were on, let's say, budget balance. So there was no net wealth creation for the private sector,
and no transfer of income from France, obviously.
From the metropolis. That's how it works. Yeah. Right. So sound finance, has as antecedents the colonial system. The colonial system epitomized sound finance. And when you use an MMT lens, you can understand all those things very clearly. And you could see all the, let's say, economic consequences of that. But for my own research also, MMT has been very important because in Francophone Africa, we had this view that national currencies are dangerous, really dangerous. Because if you had your national currency, Zimbabwe.
Wow. Just automatically, no explanation, just Zimbabwe.
Yeah. Well, in Spanish we have Argentina. Venezuela is also a favorite.
In Africa, it's Zimbabwe.
If you don't couple your currency to the US dollar, you will get Venezuela. It's like the horror story told to children before going to bed.
But so the CFA franc, obviously we're drawing parallels between the Eurozone and the CFA franc countries, but in the Eurozone, the common currency has created imbalances between nations. So there are some big winners and some big losers of the stability, in inverted commas. Is it the same in Africa? Has some African nations benefited more than others from this arrangement, or is the only country that benefits here France?
Not really. In fact, the CFA franc is an arrangement benefiting French companies, first of all.
Okay.
See? And for most of the, let's say, the five biggest countries of the CFA franc, because we have two zones, one in West Africa, 8 countries, and another one in Central Africa, 6 countries. In Central Africa, most of them are oil producers, you see. But when you look at the evolution of the real GDP per capita on a long-term basis, it has been declined for most of them. You take, for example, the case of Cote d'Ivoire, which is the richest country in the CFA franc zone. In 2016, its real GDP per capita was 1/3 lower than its peak real GDP per capita in 1978. That means more than four decades before, you see. So that has been the impact of the CFA franc, deflationary environment. And when you have an economic crisis or political crisis, the currency system will aggravate the crisis because it will function procyclically. Less public spending, less credits to the economy, and growing international debt. That's how it works. And at the same time, as the currency is so overvalued and you don't have the possibility to devalue, that means you could not obtain foreign exchange because you have a trade deficit. And so the only thing you could do is that to lend money to the IMF, and and the debt.
Internal devaluation as well, right? Like in the Eurozone country, the only solution when you have a trade imbalance is to apply austerity and, internal devaluation, meaning, making sure that wages don't grow, or even better if they go down, right? Real wages.
But it's self-defeating.
And also, exactly, self-defeating. But also, what is interesting is that basically the country making the decisions of when the currency is devalued and how much it's devalued is France. The interest of the countries is never taken into consideration. It's the Ministry of Finance, I guess, or the French Treasury who decides if and when and how much the CFA francs are devalued, right?
Yeah. In fact, the CFA franc was devalued once vis-a-vis the French franc. It has always been pegged to the French franc. And between 1948 and 1991, it hasn't been devalued. 1994, and it has been devalued on 1st January 1994. And France used blackmail to devalue. Well, if you don't accept to devalue, well, you'll be cut from, let's say, international aid, and you will not be able to pay your civil servants and so on. So we're going to devalue. Yeah. And in fact, France promises to, let's say, to guarantee the peg to its own currency, the French franc, and now the euro. This guarantee means that, French Treasury, I promise to lend to your central bank in West Africa and also in Central Africa to lend you reserves, franc reserves in my own currency, French franc, and afterwards euros. When you have no longer any exchange, any foreign exchange, that's the promise of guarantee. But it had never functioned. Why? Because the monetary policy, exchange rate policy is managed by the French Treasury itself. And whenever the level of foreign exchange reserves start to decline, they will, let's say, have a much more, let's say, restrictive monetary policy and austerity. You limit public spending, you limit credits to the economy, and and you replenish your foreign exchange reserves. You could also borrow money abroad, and that's how it works. And so the French guarantee is a fiction. It doesn't exist. And in a fiduciary, let's say, monetary system, what is the meaning of guarantee? But they are always using this fiction to say that the French Treasury guarantees the CFA franc. And there are many economists saying that, France is guaranteeing the CFA franc.
Yeah.
Oh my
but
God.
never paid a penny.
No, in fact, the African central banks were lending money to the French Treasury because they are obliged to deposit 1/2 of their foreign exchange reserves to the French Treasury, not the Bank of France, but to the French Treasury. For example, if Cote d'Ivoire sells 1 million worth of cocoa, half will go to the French Treasury and it will be stored there. That's how it works. And normally, the French Treasury pays an interest. but the interest has been negative in real terms. That's how it has worked, let's say, since the beginning. So that means that Africans were putting their foreign exchange reserve freely for the, let's say, the discretionary spending of the French treasury.
And the French treasury is collecting the interest on the foreign reserves.
Yeah.
Sounds like a good deal for the French. One of the things, I mean, reading through your book also, is that the whole, the language, the institutional setup, the rules, even the financials, the convergence rules, right? The limit to the total debt to GDP ratios, deficit to GDP ratios, almost a carbon copy of the institutional framework and setup of the Eurozone, right? So it's like, in fact, something that I think few people are aware of, CFA francs are really part of the Eurozone. Even though they're not, most people are not aware of this. It's just a subdivision of the euro, with I guess the added insult that the African countries have no seat in the European Central Bank. Not that it has a lot of relevance, because we in Spain have a seat at the central bank, but that doesn't mean that the central bank makes any monetary policy decisions that are really in our interest. But at least we have the I guess fiction or the illusion that we have some say in the central bank, the European Central Bank. But your countries don't even have a seat in the European Central Bank. But France does have a seat in your central banks, right? And it has a disproportionate share in the votes of those the governing councils of those central banks, right?
Yeah, France used to have an veto power explicit in the statutes, but now it has been hidden. It still have the veto power, but it's implicit. For example, the Monetary Policy Committee could take the decisions freely, but they could not touch the peg, you see. And if they want to change the statutes, unanimity is required. So that means the French representative. So it has become implicit. But as the French is the French government is the guarantor, so that means that it's a French currency. It's not an African currency. It's a French currency used by Africans. But what happened with the Maastricht process is that starting from 1994, the CFA franc has been recalibrated to suit, let's say, the European, let's say, macroeconomic framework of the criteria of convergence, etc. All this austerity mindset. You see, independent central bank, low inflation targeted for less than 3%, and GDP, debt GDP ratio below 70%, etc. All those aspects started from 1994. And what is interesting is that when France abandoned its franc for the euro, France itself negotiated the peg of the CFA franc to the euro, and it made a deal with the European Union monetary authorities and countries like Germany, saying that, well, my guarantee will not expose the eurozone because, well, it's a fiction. France will never take its money to give to African countries for guaranteeing the CFA franc. And they say, okay, if there is no budgetary risk, we accept the principle of the peg. But if France want to, let's say, extend its so-called guarantee to other countries, France should refer that prioritarily to the Eurozone monetary authorities. And if a country, from African country, let's say Ghana, would like to enter the CFA franc zone, normally this also should be referred to the European Union monetary authorities. So that means that legally speaking, we are under the double tutelage of France and the Eurozone monetary authorities. So you're right to say that we are an annex of the Eurozone.
So Africa was part of the Maastricht deal, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interestingly enough, to the benefit of mostly French corporations, right? Because in essence, they are still dominating most of the, trade and a lot of the contracts probably with governments and infrastructure construction and so forth is still being carried out by French companies, right? Like Vinci and so forth.
Yeah, their market shares have been declining.
Okay.
Yeah, they have been declining
because of
their
Chinese competition, basically, and so
Chinese, Moroccan competition, Turkish, etc. But recently, there had been, let's say, a move to, let's say, to conquer more market shares, and this has been done through the so-called public-private partnerships, which are just a way of making African countries be indebted in foreign currencies to finance projects which are not beneficial to the majority of the population. All those so-called plans for emergence in Africa are kind of things like that, a list of public-private partnerships just to make sure that French companies benefit from that. And you see, there was a recent report by the French Treasury about the bilateral relationships between France and Senegal. And they were saying that the development plan of Senegal had benefited the French companies. They wrote it themselves. Yeah.
Can I also ask, I know this is a little bit off the subject slightly, but I'm sure you're well aware that the World Bank has quite a strong presence in Africa. And I was just wondering whether you saw their presence as ultimately positive, or is this, in what is the role they play in all this drama, I guess?
Well, the World Bank and the IMF, I think, are the two most hated institutions in Africa. Because nobody would ever forget what they did to African countries during the structural adjustment plans of the 1980s to the 2000s. This has been horrible for large sections of the African populations, even my middle income classes. So when you say World Bank and IMF, people know it's about misery, for sure. They had a very bad image in throughout Africa, beyond even Francophone Africa. But our government, they are always happy to say that the IMF says that we have worked correctly, the IMF taxes, etc.
Yeah, big issue in Latin America as well. Costa Rica, for example, I'm aware of, the government is negotiating an agreement with the IMF, and there's of course a lot of concern among trade unionists and progressive movements in Costa Rica, because they know what's going to happen, what's coming next, and because allegedly the government of Costa Rica has run out of money, but really what they mean is the government of Costa Rica has difficulties sustaining the pegged exchange rate with the US dollar. That's what they really mean. But they're saying, oh, we need the money to pay for teachers' salaries and so forth, and I guess doctors and nurses. And well, you're not going to pay them in US dollars. We know you're going to continue to pay them in the local currency, and somebody else will take the US dollars that you get from the IMF, right? So same story again and again. Also in the Eurozone, in the last crisis, we started experiencing our own medicine in Southern Europe. So we're beginning to see the effects of that in terms of degradation of social services, inability to deal with the pandemic, for example, etc. There's been, I know, increasing awareness about the neocolonial nature of the CFA francs and the current arrangements, and there has been some discussion about an African monetary and economic union, the ECOWAS, and even discussions and conversations about establishing in truly African a single currency. And my question there is jumping out of the CFA francs into another common currency, something more like jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. How do you? Because given my experience with the Eurozone, my concern would be, well, what's the difference? Yeah, you get rid of the uncomfortable French parasite, but you still have the same set of austerity mindset and rules, and
because otherwise they become Zimbabwe, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah. So
So I see you shaking your head, Ndongo. So I'm assuming you're in agreement. You're not pro this union, this new currency?
Not at all. And that is really sad because we have many comrades who are against the CFA franc, and they say that we have the alternative is the ECOWAS single currency. The ECOWAS is an economic community for West African states. So the 15 countries of West Africa, including the 8 that use the CFA franc. And they do not understand that, the issue with the CFA franc is not only that it is a neocolonial currency dominated by France, but it is a single currency. And so let's say the problem raised by being in a monetary union would still be there if you go to the ECOWAS single currency. And the ECOWAS single currency has been sought like the euro. That means it's a tropicalized euro. And it will be, let's say, it will never be applied. I know that, never, never, for political reasons, because France doesn't want to get rid of the CFA franc, and some francophone neo-colonies like Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal don't want, let's say, to associate with this Nigeria. Nigeria will never want to peg its currency to the euro, and Nigeria will never be part of a monetary union where Nigeria is not the boss, for sure. So it's a political issue. And for me, we could stay, let's say, 4 decades, 5 decades, speculating about the future of this eco. We'll never have this single currency because it's most of all a political issue. But you see that in West Africa, we have much more imbalances compared to the Eurozone, because Nigeria itself is Germany, France, and Italy combined, proportionately speaking. You see, and Nigeria is an oil producer and exporter, while most of the others are oil importers. So that means they do not need to be in the same monetary union. And the thing is, everything they want to achieve through the monetary union could be achieved by other means, with each country having its own national currency. For me, it's possible. There are technical actions we could have to achieve, let's say, monetary solidarity, but in a framework of monetary flexibility, each country having its own national currency. But for now, we have just extremes. People saying that either it's the CFA franc or the ECOWAS single currency. And in fact, if you omit France, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
I very much like that framing, because one of the big kind of pushbacks that you get in the Eurozone when you talk about, sovereignty and national currencies is that they say, oh, that's, you just nationalistic and you don't care about anybody else. And, having a common currency is apparently about solidarity. And I like the framing that you give it, Ndongo, because you hit it right on the nail on the head there, that it's about flexibility whilst also maintaining monetary solidarity between nations,
And it's also about democracy, because it's very hard to have a real democracy unless you have some degree of control over your own resources. Otherwise, if you're using someone else's currency, you don't have the capacity to create your own currency. You're basically sentencing that country to a permanent unemployment and infrautilization of their own resources. And it's a critical, I think it's a critical point for a real true democracy to have your own currency. And
it just highlights to me the importance of education, and really like the book that you wrote and all the work that you're doing to actually let people know about the mechanisms whereby a currency ensures sovereignty, democracy, as Stuart is most keen on, and myself as well, but also just on self-determination and these ideas.
Education is really important, and I think one of our challenge when we wrote this book is to say that we can write a book which could be accessible to everyone. Everyone will have access to this book, will understand how things work. Because generally, every time people criticize the CFA franc, the mainstream, let's say the officials, the French Treasury and so on, they say that people are ignorant. They know nothing about the currency issues. So they are ignorant. They can't understand. It's much too complicated. So you cannot criticize because it's much too complicated for them. And we have tried to write a book saying that we're going to write a book which will be understandable for everybody. So that we're going to demystify the CFA franc. Everybody could understand all the intricate mechanisms of this colonial currency arrangement. And so that this will help, let's say, move forward, let's say, the fight for monetary emancipation. And I think this has to go on. And I think body of work like MMT is really important to that regard. Because generally people say that, yeah, we know many countries, they have their currencies, but it doesn't work. So why you want to change the CFA franc? But when you use an MMT perspective, you know that, yeah, the currency is functional as long as you use it to mobilize your domestic resources. If you are in a perspective of mobilizing your domestic resources, that means the currency will be functional and you could create prosperity, jobs for your population. And I think, yeah, it's really important to have such kind of perspective. And myself, I'm doing the efforts I can to try to use this perspective, the MMT perspective, to explain to ordinary people how things work. And when you explain that, yeah, you create a new universe, a new horizon for, let's say, for emancipation.
Bueno, está con nosotros Ndongo Samba Sylla. Como les dije, el vídeo estaba pregrabado con subtítulos en castellano. Y bueno, ahora mismo pues está él aquí con nosotros. Hello, Ndongo, you have your micro is switched off. And welcome. You have public from Argentina, from Costa Rica, from Spain, from Mexico, I think. So global audience here. And anybody who wants to ask questions, cualquiera que quiera hacer alguna pregunta, es la oportunidad de hacerlo y adelante. Recuerden que tienen el micro cerrado, tienen que abrirlo primero. Y si no se anima nadie, yo empiezo con una pregunta. Raquel, del Grupo Bolívar. Y Julián también. Bueno, por el chat pueden ir pidiendo los turnos. Así que...
Hola, ¿qué tal? Bueno, mucho gusto. Primero es un honor estar con Ndongo acá y el resto de los compañeros. ¿Cuándo se traduce al español? Es mi pregunta. Si necesitas una traductora, yo puedo traducir del inglés al español, pero me parece que sería de imprescindible lectura para Latinoamérica, porque la experiencia de los países hermanos de África es algo que está muy alejado de nosotros en historia, porque se ha impuesto una especie de barrera entre lo que es Latinoamérica y África, y hay una cuestión cultural, sobre todo en Argentina, de mirar hacia el norte, Europa, o en los últimos tiempos Estados Unidos. Entonces casi que es un impedimento epistemológico no poder mirar qué es lo que pasa ahí al lado de nosotros en el sur, digamos.
Ndongo, Raquel is asking about when the Spanish version is coming out. And she's offering also to do the translation from English into Spanish. And she's also commented on the barrier, the cultural barrier between Latin America and Africa. There's this I guess, this sort of tendency to look towards the north rather than look at your neighbors on the other side of the ocean, right? And this epistemological barrier between Africa and Latin America. I don't know if you want to comment on that. And then Julian Sanchez has a question.
I will start first of all to thank you all, different public. It's really a great pleasure to be among you here. And I have to thank my friend Stuart for organizing this, and also Patricia, who was there to organize the podcast. So thank you very much, everybody, to be here. It's a great pleasure. Yeah, I would like my co-friend and I would like to have a Spanish version, but for now we don't have any, let's say, any proposal for that. Yeah, but yeah, if you know when and a publisher which would be interesting, we would be very glad to have this book edited in Spanish. And we also thank Raquel for her offer to translate it. It's really superb. So if we find a publisher, you will be our translator for sure.
I will ask Carlos Garcia to take an interest in reading the book, and because he has a publishing company in Berlin and Germany, so maybe he can also translate to German, who knows, but I will ask him about this. Julián, adelante. En inglés, si quieres, tú te manejas bien en inglés, ¿no?
Yo hablaría en inglés, pero si me dejas hablar en español, así que más cómodo para mí.
Bueno, pues adelante.
Bueno, si hablo en inglés, bueno, venga, lo voy a intentar en inglés para... in first place, I want to give my congratulations to Ndongo. The exposition has been great and amazing. I have enjoyed very much with the fiction of the construction. Every monetary agreement is a fiction, I think so, and there are a lot of lies. So you have done a very good work making clear the fiction and lie. I have several questions because the problem is so big and so important. One question is this: is there any parallelism between dollarization, for example, in South America and your monetary system? I mean, if your bank, the central bank or the private bank in Senegal, must have French francs or euros. I mean, if there is something like the monetary multiplier or something like this in this monetary system. Another question is, what do you think, for example, of Algeria? I think Algeria is an African independent country, I think, or I am wrong, I don't know. And instead of talking about Zimbabwe, I think you can talk about Algeria, I think. I don't know very much about Africa, but I am from Canary Island. So I was born in Africa, in the north of Africa, but I don't know very much. And the third question is, we have to talk about King's project of international bank, the Bancor. I think it could be a good solution for an international monetary system, an international, independent, international bank that treats with equality debtors and creditors. If you have a lot of creditor balance, you have to spend. So that's my question, and I'm very happy to hear you, and it's very, very good work. I hope to read your book. Thanks a lot.
Voy a traducir al español primero la pregunta. First, I'll translate the question to Spanish, okay? So, lo que está, bueno, le está preguntando, en primer lugar, por, digamos, el paralelismo entre, bueno, primero le ha hecho una reflexión sobre cómo Ndongo, digamos, destapa la ficción monetaria, ¿no? Cómo todo sistema monetario tiene un elemento de ficción o de mentira, ¿no? Y luego las tres preguntas que le ha planteado son, la primera, si hay algún paralelismo entre la situación de los países dolarizados de América Latina, que tienen, bueno, si tiene, por ejemplo, los bancos centrales de África la obligación o la necesidad de mantener reservas de divisa extranjera. La segunda pregunta, si se puede tomar como ejemplo el caso de Argelia, que es un país africano que se independizó completamente, y en vez de tomar como ejemplo Zimbabue, pues que se tome el ejemplo de Argelia. Y el tercero, si considera útil la propuesta de Keynes del Bancor, ¿no? De esta propuesta del sistema monetario internacional, en el que, bueno, pues los deudores y acreedores tenían, digamos, un tratamiento o unas condiciones digamos, o una necesidad de hacer ajustes de forma más equitativa que bajo un sistema monetario como el actual. Okay, so go ahead, Ndongo, your floor.
Thank you very much, Julian, for these questions. Before answering, I'll answer the one aspect of Raquel's questions. It's about the cultural divide. I think in Africa, we have much to learn from Latin America, I think, because Latin America has been, let's say, forward in the world in terms of social movements and I think political theory. And it's sad that most of our reflections, especially in Francophone Africa, are derived from France and also, let's say, more and more from North America. While the major political, let's say, creative thinking has been happening in Latin America for at least 4 decades.
I'm going to stop you there so I can make short translations. Otherwise, it'll be impossible for me to remember all that you said. Bueno, lo primero que ha dicho Ndongo que es que en África también tienen que fijarse o aprender de lo que ocurre en América Latina, porque ahí van por delante de alguna manera en muchos movimientos sociales, en teoría política, y en cambio pues en África se han estado inspirando más en lo que ocurre en Francia y sin embargo pues lo más creativo quizás está ocurriendo en América Latina, ¿no? So go ahead, next section.
Yeah. And there are more and more people, intellectuals in Africa interested, let's say, in the work, for example, of Hannibal Quijano, Enrique Dussel, and people like that about, let's say, decoloniality. And I think this is, let's say, good trend. And I think we have to do maximum efforts so that such kind of works be available, let's say, in English, in French, so that African people, African intellectuals like myself could diversify their, let's say, their references, intellectual references.
Okay. Sí, ha dicho que bueno, hay intelectuales en África que están ya interesados en el trabajo, por ejemplo, gente como Aníbal Quijano, esos trabajos también sobre descolonización, y que bueno, que considera que es una buena tendencia y que habría que hacer un esfuerzo para asegurar que esos textos estuvieran disponibles en inglés y francés para que bueno, pues, los intelectuales africanos pudieran conocerlo y divulgarlos, ¿no? Go ahead.
Regarding dollarization, in fact, there is no dollarization in the CFA franc zone. And the simple reason could be, in fact, is that, yeah, the CFA franc is a French franc, in fact, basically. So we could say it's the disguised dollarization. And this fact has been acknowledged by the first report on the franc zone. So the franc zone was a colonial monetary and trade zone created during colonial times before Second World War. And the first report about this zone was in 1953. And this report said that in the franc zone, you have many currencies, many issuing institutions, different types of banknotes. But in fact, there is only one currency, despite the diversity of banknotes of currency issuing institutions. It's the French franc, you know. So when you hold the CFA franc, you held the French franc, and now we could say that the CFA franc is a kind of disguised euro.
Sí, lo que dice que en relación a la pregunta sobre la dolarización, bueno, dice que no es que haya dolarización en África, lo que hay es una zona franco-CFA, donde, bueno, pues básicamente el franco CFA es un franco francés. De una forma, podemos hablar de una dolarización oculta, ¿no? Bueno, porque en la zona del franco CFA se estableció ya en la época colonial. Los primeros informes que hablaron sobre el franco CFA fueron, pues, se remontan al año 53, 1953. Y ya se habla entonces de que aunque había muchos bancos centrales, muchos emisores, muchos billetes, muchas monedas, en realidad se trataba de una única divisa que era el franco CFA, y hoy en realidad eso es el euro, ¿no? Es una división del euro. Go ahead.
Regarding Algeria, it's true that it's a country which has done efforts to remain sovereign politically from France, because Algeria had a war of liberation, let's say a bloody war of liberation, to obtain its independence. So for them, political sovereignty is really important. And one way to obtain political sovereignty is to do your best not to be indebted in foreign currency. And Algeria, which is an, let's say, hydrocarbon producer and exporter, has most of the time done that. That means having a very limited, let's say, debt in foreign currency. They achieved that. But the shortcoming of Algeria is that they didn't have good leadership first. They could have nationalist leadership, but it was not, let's say, a kind of enlightened leadership that would use the monetary powers of, let's say, Algeria, all their resources to good use. So, for example, they have struggled to use in an optimal way all their foreign exchange reserve coming from the export of oil and gas.
Okay. Vale, sobre Argelia, dice que es verdad que es un país bueno, pues que ha hecho un esfuerzo por defender su soberanía política, después de haber superado una guerra de independencia muy sangrienta. Y bueno, pues su política ha tratado de defender esa soberanía económica también, y uno de los mecanismos evidentemente ha sido no endeudarse en divisa extranjera. También es verdad que Argelia es un país exportador de hidrocarburos, lo cual le ha permitido, digamos, evitar ese endeudamiento o limitarlo mucho, pero digamos, la desventaja de Argelia ha sido un liderazgo, un político penoso o no muy ilustrado en cuanto al conocimiento del potencial de la utilización de la moneda para movilizar tus propios recursos o aprovechar, digamos, las divisas generadas por las exportaciones para, digamos, hacer, digamos, las mejores compras o adquisiciones de recursos extranjeros, ¿no? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. And the last point was about Bangkok. Yeah, it has been, let's say, a proposal that is recurrent. It has been proposed many times. Every time there had been, let's say, a crisis, debt crisis, or crisis in the international monetary system. But the thing is, from my own perspective, how to address what is called the transfer problem. The transfer problem is that, yeah, when you have, let's say, a deficit in your current account deficit, you have to pay it in foreign currencies. And this triggers a number of economic consequences. For example, the depreciation of your exchange rate, inflation, and this will also create many social troubles within countries of the global periphery. So I think the first thing is how we could address that. Giving, let's say, economies of the global south way to pay their current account deficits in their own currency. If we could achieve that with the Bangkok, why not? But the thing with the Bangkok is that normally we are supposed to evolve in a regime of fixed exchange rate, and fixed exchange rate could have, let's say, could somehow limit the monetary sovereignty of countries. So the thing is how we could address the transfer problem while at the same time giving countries of the global south some monetary flexibility. Okay. And for that, yeah, I don't have a clear proposal.
Ok, sobre el Bancor, bueno, dice que es una propuesta recurrente que se recobra o que se recupera con cada crisis de los sistemas financieros y monetarios, ¿no? Lo que pasa es que desde su perspectiva lo que hay que hacer es abordar el problema de transferencia, ¿no? ¿Qué ocurre, que se plantea cuando hay un país que tiene un déficit por cuenta corriente, tiene que pagar en divisas. Eso genera unas tensiones de depreciación, inflación y problemas incluso sociales en los países de la periferia global, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cómo abordar o cómo conseguir que estos países puedan hacer los pagos con su propia divisa? Es uno de los grandes problemas y quizás el banco podría aportar alguna solución, pero tiene una pega y es que es un régimen de tipo de cambio fijo, lo cual también a la vez pues, tiende a socavar el propio ejercicio de la soberanía monetaria. Así que, bueno, pues es una propuesta interesante, pero que él no acaba de ver claro cómo se puede llevar a la práctica, ¿no? Okay, so go ahead. Okay, I think that was the last question, ¿eh? Yeah. Okay. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Ahí, Julián. ¿Otra pregunta? Has levantado la mano en el chat. A ver. Okay, there's a comment here from Raquel Pina saying they have done a point of not translating Latin American work in Africa and the other way around. They have balkanized us culturally. O sea que dice que intencionadamente no se ha evitado traducir trabajos latinoamericanos en África y viceversa, y que de alguna forma eso consigue una balcanización cultural, ¿no? No sé si hay otras preguntas. Yo también tengo alguna pregunta por aquí, antes de saltar a la mía, si alguien se anima.
I have a question.
Ok, ¿quién es? Perdón.
Is it possible? Okay.
Ah, Miguel, sí, adelante, sí. Question from Miguel.
I want to congratulate for your job. I told you that it's an excellent job, wonderful and credible, and very useful. I want to ask you a question very simple. With the pandemic, as you know, in the Eurozone, the rules of the balance budgetary has been well, we asked for the escape clause. So we are out of this kind of obligations during a period that is not clear what time will be. But what is the situation in Africa with this pandemic situation? You can that in this occasion, in this time, is it possible that the French treasurer will take any kind of responsibility for the changement of the CFA franc in relation with the euro?
Ha preguntado dos cosas. La primera es si en la zona euro se han suspendido las reglas de equilibrio presupuestario, la cláusula de escape, que han sido suspendidas temporalmente. Y si pregunta si esa es la situación también en África. Y también pregunta sobre si el Tesoro francés de tomar alguna decisión sobre el tipo de cambio del franco CFA, o de los francos CFA, porque son dos en realidad. Okay. Go ahead, Ndongo.
So I start by greeting Miguel. It's great to see you here. When the Eurozone removed all the austerity criteria, like the limit on the public deficit and debt, we followed suit in the safer zone. We followed suit. And our president in Senegal, my president, Macky Sall, recently was in Paris for a summit about the financing of Africa. And he was pleading to remove further the limits in terms of public deficit and also public debt. But the thing is, he was pleading that in order to have the possibility to borrow more in foreign currency, you see. While they should do differently, that means try to mobilize their own domestic resources. And that's why you are hearing very silly figures saying that Africa needs, I don't know, $5 billion to do this and that. But the issue, you could not frame it like that. You have first to identify the real resources you need and to what extent you could produce locally or not. If you could produce locally, you could use your own currency to do that. You don't need the help of France or IMF. But every time they had these silly things. So in Senegal, we are at 67% of debt GDP ratio, and we have to spend more. How government has to spend more? So they are saying, please allow us to spend more. But spending more means borrowing more. and that could not be sustainable, you see.
Sí, comenta que en relación a la primera pregunta, que efectivamente que cuando en la zona euro se suspendieron esas reglas de déficit y deuda, pues en los países africanos se siguió la misma decisión. Pero bueno, se da la circunstancia de que ha habido una cumbre financiera de países africanos en París y el presidente Senegal allí estuvo, bueno, pues solicitó que esos límites de deuda y déficit se eliminaran, pero paradójicamente para endeudarse más en una divisa extranjera, ¿no? En lugar de tratar de movilizar los recursos de los que disponen los países africanos. Entonces se habla, por ejemplo, de que se necesitan 5.000 millones de dólares, pero claro, eso lo único que va a hacer es aumentar el endeudamiento en divisa extranjera. Lo primero que se tendrían que enfocar es en identificar los recursos que existen ya en África y que se podrían movilizar utilizando la propia divisa africana, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, se encuentra Senegal, por ejemplo, en un ratio de deuda sobre el PIB del 67% y se necesita gastar más, pero el problema es cuando se plantea gastar más en una divisa extranjera, ¿no? Con endeudamiento en una divisa extranjera. Okay. There was another question, Ndongo.
Yeah. About the role of France in the times of pandemic. In fact, when there are financial issues, foreign exchange rate issues in the CFA franc countries, the attitude of France is always could always be predicted. They'll come back with the IMF. The IMF will lend the money, but you have to implement austerity policies. That's how it works. And it has been very strange that at the time of pandemic, where many, let's say, currencies of the global south are depreciating, our currency has been appreciating because it is back to the euro, you see. So France has no role. It's just, they just come with the IMF, and yeah, the IMF will do what he used to do.
De acuerdo. Bueno, sobre el papel de Francia durante la pandemia, bueno, pues van a hacer lo que han hecho siempre. Cuando hay problemas, la respuesta de Francia siempre ha sido, bueno, pues hacer o dejar que venga el Fondo Monetario Internacional, ese fondo de miseria instantáneo en acertada, ¿no? Denominación de Chunjang-Puemi. Y bueno, pues aplicar, pero a cambio aplicar esas políticas de austeridad, ¿no? Y bueno, que son tan dañinas. Paradójicamente, mientras en casi todos los demás países las divisas se han depreciado, ¿no? En los países en desarrollo, en África, la divisa, el franco CFA o los francos CFA se han estado apreciando, ¿no? Respecto al euro, ¿no? Lo cual supongo que empeora la situación. Ok, ¿más preguntas?
I have a question.
Ok, Mauricio.
Can you hear me well?
Costa Rica, ok, yeah.
Yeah. Ndongo, very nice to meet you. I'm part of I'd say a small but emerging MMT movement in Costa Rica, very small still. We haven't, at least I haven't read your book, but I'm really looking forward to reading it. And I think that's, as Raquel Pina said, it's I think it's really important for Latin Americans to learn more about what's happening in Africa, and not just always, as we tend to do, just look north to the US or to Europe. So I think this is really good work. So my question was, you at the end of your interview, you talked a little bit about this idea of monetary solidarity and achieving monetary solidarity between countries without the need to form a monetary union, especially a monetary union under the neoliberal rules. So, and I guess that seems really interesting to me, because the region where we're from, which is like a sub-region of Latin America, which is Central America, right? It's composed of really small countries, very disconnected. So you have Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras. I mean, each country, it's like its own universe. We don't look at ourselves, we tend to look to the US. And so how, right, in such a context, what would be like specific technical things that we could do to start building that monetary solidarity without the need to have a monetary union? So that's one question. And then the other question is, if you can talk a little bit more about this equal currency. I mean, who's behind it? Is it Nigeria? Yeah, I was just curious about trying to understand the equal currency a little bit better. Thank you.
Bien, traduzco la pregunta rápidamente y le dejo la palabra a Ndongo. Entonces, bueno, pues él representa una pequeño grupúsculo de teoría monetaria moderna. Somos pequeños en todas partes, Mauricio. Somos marginados. Somos la peste de los apestados en la ciencia económica. Entonces, bueno, pues le parece muy importante que en Latinoamérica se aprenda sobre lo que está ocurriendo en África y le felicita por su trabajo. Y su pregunta es, ¿cómo se aplica esa solidaridad monetaria entre países sin unión monetaria, ¿no? Bajo reglas neoliberales? Le interesa porque él es de una región de América Latina, América Central, donde hay países pequeños muy desconectados entre sí, Nicaragua, Guatemala, etcétera, pero que paradójicamente se ignoran, ¿no? O se dan la espalda y se centran todos en mirar a lo que pasa en Estados Unidos. Y bueno, pues le gustaría saber técnicamente cómo se podría llevar a cabo esa solidaridad monetaria entre países. Y luego también querría que aportara más información sobre la divisa la ECO, que se estaba planteando en la comunidad económica, ¿no? de países de África Occidental y quién está detrás, si es Nigeria, y bueno, si puede desarrollar un poquito más ese punto. Go ahead, Ndongo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mauricio, for your questions. Regarding the first question, I have to say at the outset that my perspective about MMT, because I use MMT as a way of also thinking alternatives for Africa. I use MMT in the, let's say, in the perspective of delinking the concept of Saminamin. That means that you have to rebalance relationships between, let's say, domestic economies and let's say, the dictates of the global economy. The priorities of domestic economies should be, let's say, much more important than the dictates of the global economy. And that means that if you have, let's say, national development plan, you need to have your currency. And generally, the arguments about monetary union is the standard argument that you'll save on, let's say, transaction costs. And I think this is a poor way of defending monetary union. At least we could say we want monetary union because we want to be a greater geopolitical power. And that means that you are in a political project, not just a project of saying that you want to attack financial, global finance, or you want to save on transaction costs. So for me, given the difficulties of having, let's say, a federation of states, political federation, even in West Africa, I think that we could build instruments that help us achieve the expected benefits of monetary unions while avoiding their shortcomings. For example, if the goal is to facilitate trade between countries, you could have a unit of account which will help settle trade between different countries. You could have swap lines between countries. You could have regional payment systems between countries. If the goal of the monetary union is, for example, to limit let's say, the volatility of exchange rates, why not having, let's say, a regional or continental monetary fund that will help to some extent, let's say, manage this volatility? And this monetary fund could somehow, let's say, countries could deposit one part of their foreign exchange reserve to that monetary fund. And this could help create a form of solidarity between countries. And another thing is that if I take the case of West Africa, we are depending a lot on importations of energy products and food products. While we have everything, we have the real resources in Africa, which allow us to have sovereignty regarding food products, sovereignty regarding energy products. So instead of having, let's say, free trade, we could have common, let's say, frameworks of cooperation to have regional, let's say, sovereignty on food and on energy. And this would release an important amount of foreign exchange reserves we could use for other purposes, you see.
Okay. So, sorry, this was a long stretch, so I hope I picked up everything. Okay. Bueno, en relación a esta cuestión, ¿se podría plantear algún tipo de federación de estados sin unión monetaria? Bueno, aprovechando, digamos, el concepto de desvinculación o desacoplamiento que desarrolló Sami Amir, donde, bueno, se trata de priorizar, digamos, las necesidades de las economías domésticas frente a las necesidades de la economía global, ¿no? Tengo que decir que en la entrevista original que le hicimos a Ndongo sí que hablaba él de este concepto de Sami Amir, pero lo recortamos porque se había hecho ya muy larga y no queríamos que se extendiera de 45 minutos. Pero bueno, sí que había abordado este concepto. Ndongo está planteando que esa colaboración puede tomar múltiples formas. Una, por ejemplo, podría ser el establecimiento de una unidad de cuenta regional para el cálculo, digamos, de las obligaciones, ¿no?, en el tráfico comercial entre estos países, o el establecimiento de líneas de swap entre los bancos centrales que permitieran intercambiar líneas de divisas, o establecer sistemas regionales de compensación de pagos para facilitar, ¿no?, el comercio entre los países de la región, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, también se podría, desde un punto de vista financiero, se podría establecer un fondo monetario al que los países miembros aportaran parte de sus divisas obtenidas en el comercio internacional, las reservas de divisa extranjera, que se podrían utilizar para gestionar la volatilidad en los tipos de cambio. Y luego habla de bueno, pues estos países tienen una cierta dependencia de importaciones alimentarias y energéticas y comenta la posibilidad bueno, paradójicamente estos países tienen abundancia de recursos energéticos y alimentarios y se podría alcanzar una cierta soberanía energética y alimentaria con acuerdos, digamos, de comercio entre estos países, lo cual liberaría las reservas o las divisas extranjeras disponibles para utilizarlas en compras, digamos, de tecnología o de productos de mayor interés, ¿no?, estratégico, ¿no? En definitiva, eso es lo que... lo he resumido muchísimo porque yo creo que me he perdido alguna frase, perdonad, porque era una intervención larga. Okay, more questions?
Yeah, there's another on the eco.
Sí, hay otra pregunta que no ha contestado ya sobre la moneda del ECO. Sí, go ahead.
So ECO is short for ECOWAS. ECOWAS meaning Economic Community of West African States. So it's the regional grouping of 15 countries in West Africa. So the 8 using the West African CFA franc and 7 others having each their own national currency. This project dated back from 1983, and but it has been delayed often because there are many political and technical issues. But on the 2019, they decided to launch the ECO, let's say in 2020. But what happened was that Emmanuel Macron, French president, and the president of Côte d'Ivoire, Alassane Ouattara, in December 2019, they decided unilaterally that they would rename the CFA franc ECO, you see. So the same day that the head of states of the ECOWAS was supposed to meet to decide the launch of their currency named ECO, Macron and Ouattara in Cote d'Ivoire, they said, we're going to rename the CFA franc ECO. And since then, they have created a confusion. And in the mainstream media, you will see that Macron has decided the end of the CFA franc. Now the new currency is no longer the CFA franc, it's the ECO. But this is, let's say, a move to create confusion because we still have the CFA franc in Central Africa, shared by 6 countries. In West Africa, well, there is no legal document saying that the CFA franc will be replaced with the ECO. No legal document until now. And there is no agenda to, let's say, to substitute the banknotes and the coins CFA franc into new ECO and CFA franc banknotes. So it's just a move to disrupt everything because France want to enlarge the CFA franc dome. Maybe they could rename it ECO and to isolate Nigeria, which is a regional powerhouse representing at least 2/3 of the GDP of the region. So that is the ECO story.
Vale. Bueno, en relación al ECO es una abreviación de ECOWAS, en inglés es la Comunidad Económica de Estados de África Occidental, constituido por estos países que utilizan el franco CFA de África Occidental y 7 otros países que tenían su propia divisa. Es un proyecto que se remonta al año 83, pero que se ha ido retrasando una y otra vez. Y bueno, pues se anunció que se iba a lanzar la moneda, el ECO, en 2020, pero astutamente Macron y el presidente de Costa de Marfil decidieron, digamos, por su cuenta, renombrar el franco CFA o anunciaron que iban a rebautizar el franco CFA como el ECO. El mismo día en el que se iba a crear la nueva divisa, la nueva moneda común africana, toman esa decisión, evidentemente con la intención de perturbar o de crear confusión sobre el asunto. Pero la realidad es que hoy no hay ningún documento legal donde se haya formalizado esa, digamos, cambio de nombre, ni hay planes para cambiar ni los billetes ni las monedas con la nueva denominación. Así que realmente ha sido un plan para desarbolar, digamos, el ECO y esa es la historia del ECO hasta la fecha. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿No? No se anima a ver en el chat si hay alguna cosa en el chat. Okay, somebody is asking you to... Raquel wants to have your contact, so I will send her. Maybe you can chat together. You can send him a personal message to Ndongo, and he can give you you have her email account and cell phone number as well in the chat. Okay. Bueno, yo creo que ha sido una reunión interesante, larga. Yo tenía 3 preguntas, pero voy a hacer una sola pregunta. Y me parece muy interesante y es un punto que no se nos debe olvidar, ¿no? Y es este concepto de que los balances sectoriales y la necesidad de que, bueno, el Estado, digamos, tenga esa posición deficitaria para que el sector privado tenga su posición financiera neta positiva, ¿no? Y Ndongo lo menciona en su entrevista, el hecho de que bajo el régimen colonial, bajo ese modelo de hacienda gladstoniana, no era posible que el régimen colonial creara activos financieros para la población africana debido a que tenía que mantenerse superávit. Y me pregunto si esa situación sigue siendo vigente, es decir, si la mayor parte de los estados siguen teniendo una posición de superávit fiscal primario y, por tanto, están dificultando que los africanos puedan acumular activos financieros, ahorrar y, por tanto, tener, digamos, un proceso de acumulación que permita, ¿no? Formar o desarrollar su economía, ¿no? So, Ndongo, sorry, I was asking another final question in Spanish, but you discuss the issue that under the colonial administration, because of this Gladstonian finance framework in which countries had to have basically a fiscal surplus, it was impossible to create net financial assets for the private sector. And I was wondering if this is currently the situation in the CFA franc countries, that the countries have to be most of the time at least in a primarily fiscal surplus, and hence the states are not contributing to generating financial assets for their private sector, and the only source would hence be foreign trade. If that is the situation today, and what consequences that has for the economic development of those African countries?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It depends on fact on countries, and I would say on monetary blocks. For example, in Central Africa, they are oil producers, and with the drop in oil prices starting from 2016, there have been, let's say, depletion of their foreign exchange reserves, and at the same time, their debt to GDP ratio has increased a lot. So for these countries, they are obliged to have primary surpluses. Yeah, but in the West Africa, they are mostly net oil importers. So the economic cycle had been good for them, let's say, since 2012, and for them, they have deficits, public deficits, but most of those deficits are partly, let's say, compensated by foreign aid. For example, my country, Senegal, depends a lot on foreign aid from the EU, aid from France, principally. But so that means whenever we have deficits, generally, yeah, we rely a lot on foreign aid.
Sí, dice que va de país en país. En África Central, la mayoría de los países son productores de petróleo. Y bueno, pues bueno, en el pasado tenían evidentemente superávit comercial. Lo que pasa es que en los últimos años, con la caída del precio del petróleo, se han experimentado, digamos, el agotamiento de las reservas de divisa. Y en cambio, pues, y eso les ha obligado a estos países a mantener un superávit fiscal primario. En el África Occidental, en cambio, bueno, son importadores de crudo. Les ha ido bien, por tanto, a partir de 2012. Los estados mantienen un déficit fiscal, pero lo han compensado con ayuda externa, sobre todo de la Unión Europea y de Francia, ¿no? I would say that foreign aid really is resources that you can use to import goods produced in France and the European Union, rather than promoting the development of your own industry, right?
For example, in the case of France, I read a report from the OECD, 74% of their aid is tied. That means that 74% of their aids in fact, benefits French companies. And for some countries, you could find even higher rates of tied aid.
Sí, le estaba diciendo que esa ayuda externa, ¿no?, de Francia y de la Unión Europea en realidad va dirigida a que luego estos países compren productos fabricados en Europa y en Francia, y por tanto pues no contribuye a desarrollar su industria. Y me comenta que de hecho el 74% de la ayuda financiera que les aporta Francia pues está vinculada, digamos, a la compra de producción allí, y por tanto, bueno, lo mismo está ocurriendo en otros países, incluso con porcentajes más altos, ¿no?, de la ayuda externa que reciben. Okay, so that was, I think, it's almost 9 p.m. in Spain, 8:45. And I think it's getting a bit late. It's a bit earlier in Latin America, but I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks a lot for your time. We really have taken advantage of you with the long interview we did about a month ago, and now another long piece of your free time from weekend time. So I really appreciate that you dedicated this, and we hope to have you here sometime in Spain, or maybe I would like to go to Dakar
Yeah, why not?
sometime. I have to visit Senegal. And a good friend of mine was the son of the Spanish ambassador there, and he was always talking wonders about Senegal, and he was very nostalgic of Senegal. So I have to go and visit sometime. And thanks a lot. Y bueno, pues nada, muchísimas gracias a todos por dedicar un sábado a una actividad tan excitante como es la economía, ¿no? Así que creo que hemos aprendido muchas cosas. Yo he tomado notas y me ha gustado algunas cosas que realmente pues, me han hecho reflexionar y pensar. Y bueno, pues agradezco el tiempo que hemos dedicado, que han dedicado todos y el tiempo que ha dedicado también. Un lujo, dice Raquel. Y bueno, tienes Ndongo, you have her email and cell phone before we disconnect. If you want to take jot that data down, she wants to get in contact with you.
Yeah, I will exchange. Yeah, exchange.
Okay. Bueno, pues gracias a todos y hasta la vista.
Thank you very much. It was great to be here to have this opportunity to exchange with all of you.
Good job. Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Bye.